In the days long before Maria, Clyde, Luke or Rani, there was Sarah Jane's eternal companion, K-9, and her pesky friend Brendan, who had been the ward of her Aunt Lavinia. Together they fought off all manner of aliens and demons. Now, however, Brendan found himself alone in the Cotswolds, the place where his adventure had started all those years ago. Here on the cliffs, with the bewitched wind blowing in his face, he saw the life which Sarah Jane had shown him. Everything they'd fought off together, the Tim Vagabond, Axons, and a stray Auton or two. His deep thought was interrupted by a car dashing past on the road behind him. When Brendan looked up to see who it was, all he could see was the endless night. He himself went back to his car, which was situated behind a couple of indiscreet bins, which gave off a gut-churning aroma that hung around the area like an infestation of rats. His car was a slick, black car, which blended into the darkness perfectly. Over the years, there were people who had found to think he was mad. Given how late it was and he was out, he was beginning to agree with them. Brendan yearned for the all-encompassing warmth of his bed. Instead, he got in his car and wrapped himself in a consoling blanket which gave him a warm, light hug. Behind him, the rustic yet bold robot dog that was K-9 watched over him. "Found anything, old boy?" Brendan asked as he tucked into an open packet of jelly babies which he'd found in the hidden compartment of the car. "Negative, master," replied K-9 wearily. K-9 was beginning to show his age. He had been through so much, it didn't surprise Brendan at all. Brendan looked out the car window and up into the stars. "Do you think he's up there, K-9?" Brendan inquired. "Who, master?" "You know, the doctor. Is he really real?" "The doctor made me, so I am positive," replied K-9 bluntly. "Oh, are you now? Because you know, sometimes I wonder. The way Sarah Jane speaks of him, it's almost like some kind of mythic legend." K-9 didn't reply. It was almost like he drifted into a ghost-like sleep. Overhead, there was the incontrovertible flash of light, as if some kind of meteor hurtled down into the sea. Brendan looked up to K-9, who was still dormant. He left K-9 to his own devices while he left the car to go and investigate the mystifying light, all by himself, with no company except his torch. He was immediately greeted by the cold, harsh wind which blew in his face like a bat flapping its wings directly in his face. Brendan was overwhelmed by its power, but lured further in to see what the dark heart of the meteor contained. He heard a scuttling from above, like a lost bird far from its nest. The grass was waving in the wind, as if screaming to get away from the terror held not too far down the road. Brendan cautiously tread down the path, with only his torch guiding his way, with even the moon seeming pale and lost in comparison. Brendan came to a sharp cliff, which hung over the hills like a knife. Brendan knew whatever had to come down in the meteor shower was just beyond the cliff. He had to find a way over it. Brendan would get his wish, but maybe, just maybe, you should be careful what you wish for, as out of nowhere a hideous mutation of some kind of bat struck down and scratched him up with its vicious claws. Brendan looked up and saw the hordes of these terrifying creatures gathering around him like a group of vultures intimidating their prey. They had fangs like broken glass, which was a sickening yellow colour. Faces which looked like demons with horrific wings and sharp vines that leached into the surface of their skin. Brendan immediately darted for cover, but his act was far too late, as like a bullet, one of the creatures picked him up and like a deceased mouse and carried him over the top of the cliff. From above, Brendan could see what seemed like an infestation of ants crawling below him. But instead of ants, it was millions and millions and millions of these terrifying monsters. Brendan yelled for help, desperately squirming like a worm in a bird's beak. At the epicentre, there was a man with an abnormally large neck and a killer grin, which looked to be made of knives. The man looked oddly familiar, like Brendan had seen him on TV before, in something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He could be forgiven for this error as, let's face it, all of this wouldn't exactly be out of place in a show like Buffy, Brendan thought to himself. Brendan was plonked on the floor like a fast food meal in front of the eerie man. "Who are you?" Brendan asked the strange man. "I am Brother Lasser," he replied coldly. Not too far away, Sarah Jane drove past Brendan's car and saw K-9 still dormant and trapped inside. Sarah Jane got out of her car and went to see if there was any kind of trace of where Brendan could be. She opened the car's compartments and looked in the seat pockets, but all she found was a flask of Arctic cold tea and an empty packet of discarded jelly babies. So she decided to finally attempt to turn on K-9. She did this in the best way that she thought possible, which was to bang him on the head. It was somewhat risky, but it worked. As soon as she did so, it was almost as if she breathed life into a dead body. K-9 was alert and ready for action. "K-9! Thank goodness you're okay. K-9, where did Brendan go? I have a feeling he could be in terrible danger," she demanded to know, in a bit of a frenzy after travelling miles down from Ealing. "The Master Brendan and I saw strange lights in the sky. It is likely he went to investigate," K-9 responded. "Of course he would, wouldn't he? Come on, K-9, I think it's high time we went walkies," said Sarah Jane as she carefully removed K-9 from what appeared to be a baby seat. Meanwhile, back at the cliff, Brendan was still being interrogated by Brother Lasser and the bat-like creatures. "Believe it or not, this isn't my first alien encounter, so tell me, what species are you?" questioned Brendan, trying to buy time in the hope that someone would come for him in an epic last-minute rescue. Brother Lasser saw through this ruse, but played along with it nonetheless. "We are the Krillitane." "So how come you all of yous looks like giant bats then?" further inquired Brendan, who was starting to feel intimidated by the hordes of Krillitane above him, who seemed more and more anxious to devour him. "We are able to take the abilities such as wings, fangs, claws, etc. directly from the species and splice them into our own genetics," replied Brother Lasser, whose hunger to eat Brendan grew greater and greater with each passing moment. "How come you look like you're all like... But you're all giant bats, and you're like a humongous giraffe neck? That's so... just doesn't fit in with everything I've learned here today," quizzed Brendan, who was starting to feel like he might be onto something. "I have not yet ascended." "Ascended? What's that supposed to mean?" "It does not matter, for it is of little consequence," replied Brother Lasser, who at this point was drooling over Brendan, desperate to unleash his animalistic traits, which were hidden by like a painted smile through his cold and calculating exterior. "For the greater of ascensions is yet to come." "The greater ascension?" Brendan queried worryingly, now beginning to shake under the intense pressure and fear of his death looming from above. "The day I become a god," Brother Lasser said intensely, with a cruel smile, ready to consume Brendan like a chicken kebab. Then, from above, the sound of approaching helicopters could be heard, like lions roaring before a giant hunt. Brendan looked up and he saw these massive lights blinding him in a haze of light. Who were they, and why were they here? Elsewhere, Sarah Jane also noticed these helicopters, and immediately she ran into the road, where she could hear an intense screeching of tyres on tarmac. It was a black SUV which clung to the darkness, like a shadow across the scene. "Retreat!" called Brother Lasser, as he called for a group of Krillitanes to carry him away from the scene, leaving Brendan to his fate. This was when Brendan looked up and saw, looking directly into his own eyes, was a woman in white and grey camouflaged gear, looking down at him through the barrel of a bazooka. Brendan looked into the eyes of what would be the last person he would ever see. Back on the other side of the cliff, a tall woman with blonde hair and a sharp business-like suit. It was almost as if she'd walked straight off The Apprentice or Dragon's Den. "Who are you?" demanded Sarah Jane, looking to K-9 to make sure he stayed hidden. But from behind came a massive explosion, which erupted from the cliff with terrifying velocity, sending shudders across the whole area. "I'm Hartman, Yvonne Hartman, and we are Torchwood," explained the woman, looking into the explosion as if it was something she saw on an everyday basis. "What have you done?" asked a shaken Sarah Jane, terrified and disgusted by Yvonne's capacity to stay straight through the death and destruction that had just occurred. "Dealt with another alien threat. That is my job, Miss Smith," replied Yvonne, unable to see why Sarah Jane was so upset. "How do you know my name?" "Oh, we know a great deal about you, Miss Smith." "It hardly matters right now. You haven't dealt with an alien threat. What you've done is simple, cold-hearted murder, with a callous disregard for those you're supposed to protect," yelled Sarah Jane in fury at this woman. "I don't get your meaning," replied a confused Yvonne. "Did you know my friend was up there?" "You better hope not," said Sarah Jane as she completely lost all patience, ready to throw a fist in Yvonne's face, but resisted the temptation. "I'm afraid our priority is to the new British Empire," Yvonne replied, noticing the rising tension between herself and Sarah, who looked as if she wanted to kill her. "How could you?" replied Sarah Jane. "I don't care what you think of me, Miss Smith. I did my duty, whether you like it or not. Well, one day, I hope your duty gets its own back on you," replied Sarah Jane, as she turned fiercely away towards K-9 and back into the shadows. "Torchwood 1, this is Torchwood Mobile. Our mission is completed. Prepare to evacuate the area," said Yvonne over the radio, before getting back into the car and driving off into the night. Sarah Jane turned to K-9, who was once again dormant. Sarah Jane tried to wake him up. She tried everything, even her sonic lipstick. But it was all in vain. Brendan and K-9 were gone. Sarah Jane looked up to the stars, shining brightly above. Right now, more than ever, she needed the doctor.